Thanks for joining Action News 5 to 10. I'm Joy Redman. An FBI operation ended in dozens arrested, including police officers, sheriff's deputies, and 2 sheriffs in the Mississippi Delta.
This is breaking at 6. A massive federal takedown in the Mississippi Delta. 20 people indicted in an alleged conspiracy ring, including 2 sheriffs, several police officers, and a former state trooper. The charges target what investigators call a deep network of corruption.
The black SUVs arrived at 4:17 a.m., parked in a tight semicircle outside a brick, Tudor-style home in one of Minneapolis's wealthiest neighborhoods. No lights, no sirens, just the low hum of engines idling in the pre-dawn cold. Inside, federal agents from FBI and ICE's Homeland Security Investigations Unit checked their radios one last time. They had been tracking the man inside for 19 months. His name was Marcus Dane, a community organizer, philanthropist, and frequent guest on local news programs. He had shaken hands with governors. He had spoken at city council meetings about immigrant rights and economic justice. But the file the feds carried that morning told a different story. It told of a network that moved people across borders not to save them, but to exploit them. It told of shell companies, encrypted communications, and money that flowed in and out of legitimate nonprofits like water through a sieve. The investigation had started not with Dane, but with a tip from a caseworker in St. Paul. She had noticed something odd. Dozens of work authorization documents for laborers at a meatpacking plant, all processed through the same advocacy group, all carrying the same administrative signatures. She flagged it. The file made its way to ICE and then to an FBI task force that specialized in transnational crime. What they found was not a charity, it was a machine. Surveillance began in the summer. Agents set up observation posts in rental properties and unmarked vehicles along the tree-lined streets of Dane's neighborhood. They watched him leave for morning coffee at a local cafe, always ordering the same thing, always sitting at the same table near the window. They tracked his meetings with nonprofit board members, his lunches with local politicians, his evening visits to properties scattered across the metro area. On the surface, everything appeared legitimate, but patterns emerged. Properties he visited late at night, phone calls made from parking lots instead of his office, encrypted messaging apps that he accessed only when alone. The FBI deployed technical surveillance. They obtained warrants for his phone records, his email accounts, his financial transactions. Analysts began building link charts, connecting Dane to a web of individuals and entities that stretched from Minnesota to Texas to Central America. One name kept appearing: Victor Ruiz, a logistics coordinator based in San Antonio who had been flagged years earlier in an unrelated customs investigation. Ruiz specialized in moving people. He had contacts at bus stations, truck depots, and border checkpoints. He knew routes. He knew prices. He knew which officials could be paid to look the other way. The breach happened fast. A tactical team from FBI SWAT entered through the front and side doors simultaneously, using battering rams that splintered the reinforced frames. Dane was in his kitchen, still in a robe, holding a phone. He dropped it. The screen shattered on the marble tile, pieces skittering across the floor like broken ice. Agents swept through the house, room by room, securing the second floor, the basement, the detached garage. In the study, they found 3 laptops, 2 external hard drives, and a stack of prepaid SIM cards still in their packaging. On the desk sat a leather-bound planner, opened to a page with handwritten notes in Spanish and English. One line read, "14 arrive Thursday. Housing tight. Need 2 more locations." In the basement, agents discovered something more disturbing. Filing cabinets filled with passport photocopies, visa applications, and employment contracts written in languages most of the workers did not speak fluently. There were signed documents waiving labor rights, agreements to pay administrative fees that exceeded legal limits, and forms acknowledging debts that would take years to repay. It was a paper trail of coercion, meticulously organized and stored beneath a house valued at over $1 million. The scale became clear within hours. Forensic analysts began pulling data from Dane's devices while interview teams fanned out across the metro. By midday, agents had identified at least 43 individuals who had entered the country on temporary visas arranged or facilitated by Dane's nonprofit, then were placed in jobs that violated the terms of those visas. They worked in warehouses, construction sites, and food processing plants. Many lived in overcrowded apartments owned by shell LLCs traced back to bank accounts Dane controlled. They paid rent. They paid fees. They were told that complaining would mean deportation. One woman, a mother of two from Honduras, described living in a two-bedroom apartment with 11 other people. She worked 12-hour shifts at a poultry plant and paid $800 a month to sleep on a couch. When she asked about the visa extension she had been promised, she was told it was in process and that questioning the arrangement would put her family at risk. She stayed silent for 9 months. So did the others. The silence was not accidental. It was engineered. Dane had created a system of dependency. Workers owed him money for visa processing, for housing deposits, for transportation from the border. The debts were structured to be unpayable. Every paycheck was garnished. Every request for help came with a new fee. And because the workers were living in legal gray zones, they had no leverage, no recourse, no voice. They had come seeking safety and opportunity. They found neither. Federal investigators realized Dane had not acted alone. Financial records revealed wire transfers to an attorney in Chicago, a logistics coordinator in Texas, and a real estate broker in Milwaukee. The attorney, a woman named Claudia Vega, had filed dozens of fraudulent asylum applications, often using fabricated threat narratives. She charged upfront fees, promised outcomes she could not deliver, and left her clients stranded when applications were denied. The coordinator, Victor Ruiz, arranged transportation, moving groups of workers between states based on seasonal labor demand. The broker, Alan Krauss, leased properties under fictitious business names and collected rent in cash or through peer-to-peer payment apps that left minimal paper trails. Each played a role, each profited, and each believed they were insulated by distance, by encryption, by the sheer complexity of the operation. They were wrong. The FBI's cyber action team traced encrypted messages from Dane's phone to a server hosted in Eastern Europe. The messages were brief, transactional, written in a mixture of English and coded shorthand. One read, "New batch cleared, route through MSP, housing confirmed, wages hold at standard." Another, "Lawyer says delay is normal, keep them working, no complaints so far." The tone was clinical, efficient. There was no acknowledgement of the human beings on the other side of those words. Agents also discovered that Dane had been receiving payments from a source outside the United States. Bank records showed regular deposits from an account in Mexico, funneled through a currency exchange service in Arizona. The amounts varied, but the pattern was consistent. The payments stopped exactly 3 weeks before the raid. Someone had known the investigation was closing in. Someone had warned him. But Dane had not run. Perhaps he believed his public reputation would shield him. Perhaps he thought the evidence could be explained away. Perhaps he simply did not believe he would be caught. On the third day of the operation, ICE agents executed coordinated raids at 6 work sites across Minnesota and Wisconsin. They arrived during shift changes, identified individuals flagged in the investigation, and conducted interviews on site. Most were terrified. Some thought they were being deported. Others thought they were finally being rescued. The truth was somewhere in between. They were victims, yes, but they were also witnesses, and their testimony would be critical to building the federal case. The investigation revealed that Dane had used his public profile as cover. He appeared at fundraisers, spoke at immigrant advocacy rallies, and even hosted town halls where he criticized ICE enforcement tactics. All the while, he was running a for-profit smuggling and labor trafficking operation disguised as humanitarian work. The cognitive dissonance was deliberate. It insulated him from scrutiny. Who would suspect a man who publicly championed the vulnerable of privately exploiting them? But cracks had appeared long before the raid. A former employee of Dane's nonprofit, a bookkeeper named Linda Ortiz, had gone to the FBI 8 months earlier, bringing copies of financial documents she had been asked to destroy. She described a two-tiered system, a legitimate program that provided real services to a small number of clients, and a shadow operation that generated revenue through exploitation. She had been fired after asking too many questions. Her testimony became the foundation of the affidavit that authorized the search warrants. She later told investigators that she had been afraid to come forward, afraid of retaliation, afraid of not being believed. But she came forward anyway. By the end of the first week, federal prosecutors had enough to file charges. Dane was indicted on 12 counts, including conspiracy to commit visa fraud, harboring undocumented individuals for financial gain, money laundering, and wire fraud. The Chicago attorney was charged separately. The Texas coordinator fled, but was apprehended at a border checkpoint in Laredo 2 days later, his truck loaded with prepaid phones and fake identification documents. The Milwaukee broker negotiated a plea deal in exchange for cooperation. The network was collapsing. The arrests made headlines. Local news covered the story extensively, airing footage of Dane being led out of his home in handcuffs, his face obscured by a jacket held over his head. Talk radio exploded with debate. Some callers insisted the charges were politically motivated, an attack on immigrant advocacy. Others demanded harsher penalties, arguing the case was proof of systemic abuse. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. The human cost extended beyond the workers themselves. Families had been separated. Children had been moved between states, sometimes without proper documentation or schooling. One teenage girl told investigators she had not seen her mother in 7 months because the mother had been moved to a different job site and communication had been restricted. The girl had been told this was temporary, that it was necessary, that things would get better. They didn't. She had missed a semester of school. She had lived with strangers. She had been told to lie if anyone asked questions. Another man, a construction worker from Guatemala, described being injured on a job site and receiving no medical care because his employer, connected to Dane's network, did not want to file a workers' compensation claim. The man's wrist healed incorrectly. He could no longer grip tools with his right hand. He had come to the United States to build a better future for his family. Instead, he lost the ability to do the work that had sustained him for 2 decades. Community leaders in Minneapolis reacted with shock and anger. Some defended Dane, insisting the charges were politically motivated, a federal crackdown on immigrant advocacy in a hostile political climate. Others felt betrayed, recognizing that the exploitation had occurred under their noses, hidden behind the language of justice and compassion. One city council member, speaking anonymously to local media, said the revelation had damaged trust in advocacy organizations across the region. "How do we know who to trust now?" she asked. It was a question without an easy answer. Nonprofits that had partnered with Dane scrambled to distance themselves. Board members resigned. Donors demanded audits. Some organizations discovered they had unknowingly provided referrals to Dane's network, believing they were helping connect vulnerable individuals with legitimate services. The realization that they had been used as cover was devastating. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Prosecutors presented financial records showing that Dane had moved over $3 million through his network over a 4-year period. They presented encrypted communications, victim testimony, and evidence of Dane's control over housing, employment, and documentation. They brought in forensic accountants who traced shell company transactions. They played recordings of phone calls in which Dane discussed moving workers to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. Defense attorneys argued that Dane had been trying to help people navigate a broken immigration system, that his methods were unorthodox but not criminal, that he had been motivated by compassion rather than greed. They pointed to his public advocacy work, his charitable donations, his years of community service. They argued that the real criminals were the employers who exploited workers and the policies that created vulnerability in the first place. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found him guilty on 10 of 12 counts. Sentencing came 4 months later. The courtroom was packed. Victims sat in the gallery, some weeping, some stone-faced. Dane's family sat on the opposite side, equally silent. The judge acknowledged the complexity of immigration policy, but emphasized the exploitation at the heart of the case. She spoke about betrayal, about the abuse of trust, about the deliberate manipulation of people in desperate circumstances. Dane was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution totaling just over $2 million. The attorney received 8 years. The coordinator received 6. The broker, who had cooperated extensively, received probation and home detention. But the sentences did not undo the harm. Workers who had been exploited faced an uncertain future. Some were granted special visas as victims of trafficking, allowing them to remain in the United States and pursue legal employment. Others were placed in deportation proceedings, their status unresolved. A few chose to return to their home countries voluntarily, preferring the risks they knew to the legal limbo they faced here. Advocacy groups scrambled to provide services, but resources were limited and trust was fragile. Federal authorities used the case to push for stronger enforcement and better coordination between agencies. ICE expanded its investigative partnerships with nonprofits and local governments, aiming to identify fraudulent operations before they became entrenched. The FBI increased training on financial crimes involving immigration fraud, recognizing that exploitation often hides behind legitimate institutions. But the fundamental tension remained: a system designed to control movement colliding with human desperation, creating spaces where predators could thrive. The brick Tudor-style home in Minneapolis was seized as part of the asset forfeiture process. It sat empty for months, a quiet monument to the gap between public image and private conduct. Neighbors stopped talking about it. The lawn grew wild. Eventually, it was auctioned off, the proceeds directed toward victim restitution. A new family moved in, unaware of the history embedded in the walls. Life moved on. But for the 43 individuals whose labor had been stolen, whose trust had been weaponized, the reckoning was far from over. What do you do when the person offering help is the one doing harm? It's a question that resonates far beyond this case. In every community where vulnerability meets opportunity, where desperation meets exploitation, the answers are never simple, but the obligation to ask the question remains. And maybe that's where accountability begins, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the willingness to look closely at systems we assume are working, at leaders we assume are trustworthy, at stories we assume are true. Remember, this story is a work of fiction created for educational and entertainment purposes. If you found this compelling, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for watching.